A man suffered an accident while carrying a birthday cake for his daughter and fell into a coma. A young woman who worked in the hospital cleaning department spoke to him every day until one day something unexpected happened and she ran away. Raindrops fell heavily on Illinois, Chicago, forming small rivers on the sidewalks. The cold wind blew mercilessly, bending the branches of the trees and shaking the tarps of the closed stalls in the market. The yellowish lights on the lampposts flickered in the wind, and the few pedestrians still walking the streets huddled their shoulders, trying to protect themselves with thin coats or improvised newspapers. But Daniel Walker had no time to worry about the rain or the cold. He held the handle of the paper bag tightly, protecting the small cake as if it were a treasure. With each hurried step, the water accumulated on the ground splashed onto his worn pants, and his shoes were already completely soaked, squeaking with every movement. Daniel's face was wet, but it was impossible to tell if it was just from the rain or from the cold sweat of his haste. He looked ahead, his eyes shining with expectation. Today was a special day. Camilla, his 7-year-old daughter, was eagerly waiting for him at home. He could imagine her little eyes filling with joy when she saw the cake. It was simple, small, bought with the little money he had managed to save during the week, repairing shoes in the small space he called his workshop. But it was a cake, and for Camilla, he knew that meant everything. At every corner he turned, the biting wind pushed his body backward, but he leaned forward, defying the weather. He didn't care. The important thing was to get home. The street was almost deserted, with only a few cars passing quickly, kicking up dirty water from the puddles scattered across the worn asphalt. Daniel quickened his pace, hugging the bag to his chest, smelling the sweet scent of shoe polish mixed with the aroma of rain. His thoughts were on his daughter. Would she be awake? Would Rosa, his wife, have managed to keep her asleep by telling her that her daddy was on his way? He hoped so. He wanted to see that smile. He wanted to feel her little arms hugging his neck and hear her cheerful little voice telling him he was the best dad in the world. He crossed the street, looking quickly from side to side, not realizing how slippery the ground was. The cake wobbled slightly inside the bag, and he held it firmly, taking care not to move it more than necessary. It wouldn't be long now, just a few more blocks, and he would be there with Camilla, with Rosa, with the cake, the candles, and his daughter's warm embrace. That thought made him smile, just a tired smile but full of love. The rain grew even heavier. The wind whistled through the alleys, lifting wet leaves and pushing sheets of metal that collided with each other with terrifying crashes. At that very moment nearby, the roar of the engine echoed through the wet streets of Chicago, mixing with the sound of the heavy rain that fell relentlessly. Hector Mendes held the steering wheel with one hand, while the other hand, sliding his cell phone, his eyes alternating between the illuminated screen and the road ahead. The blue glow of the device reflected on his carefree young face as his fingers moved quickly across the words of a conversation that seemed more important than the rainy night around him. The loud music inside the car drowned out the noise of the city, a hectic rhythm that pounded in his chest like his own racing heart. The thick raindrops slipped down the windshield, quickly swept away by the windshield wipers that worked tirelessly. But even though the rain made it difficult for him to see, Hector did not slow down. The sports car cut through the wet streets like a hungry beast, gliding easily between the few red lights that flashed in the distance. He was not worried. There were not many cars at that hour. The streets were almost empty, with only a few figures hurrying crossing the sidewalks with crooked umbrellas and coats pressed tightly against their bodies. His cell phone vibrated in his hand, and he glanced at the screen. For a second, a message flashed there, a reply he had been waiting for. A short smile appeared on his lips, and he lowered his head slightly, his fingers quickly tapping the keys to reply. 1 second, 2, 3. The traffic light ahead turned red, but he didn't notice. The crossing was empty. Only the lampposts illuminated the wet asphalt, reflecting the lights of the surrounding buildings. The sound of the rain was loud, mixing with the distant noise of the city that never slept. But in the midst of it all, there was something no one could have foreseen. A man running hurriedly, clutching a paper bag to his chest, his heart full of haste and love. Daniel didn't see that the car wasn't going to stop at the traffic light. His eyes were fixed on the sidewalk across the street, on the path that led him to his daughter. 1 step, 2 steps. The icy wind hitting his face, his wet shoes slipping a little, but he steadied himself and continued on. The cake was there, safe in his hands. It was the only thing that mattered. And then it happened. A sharp sound broke the night, the noise of tires sliding on wet asphalt, the scream of someone who realized too late. The impact, the dry crash of body and metal, the bag flying, spinning in the air, scattering small pieces of icing and dough on the cold street. The rain continued to fall outside the car. Hector felt the blow vibrate throughout the vehicle. The steering wheel shook in his hands. The brakes screeched, and his chest hit the seatbelt. The world around him seemed to fall silent for an instant, as if everything were trapped in a second that never ended. His eyes flew open, his breath caught in his throat, and his heart beat loudly, heavily, as if it wanted to escape from his chest. He dropped his cell phone, which fell to the floor of the car with a dull thud. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his trembling gaze turned forward. There, in the middle of the street, under the relentless rain, a man lay motionless on the ground. The cake, or what was left of it, was scattered beside him. The white frosting mixed with the age of the asphalt. The colored candles rolled slowly away, carried by the water running down the gutter. The silence inside the car was deafening. Hector's chest rose and fell rapidly. His mind was spinning in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. His hands were shaking. He blinked, hoping that somehow all of this was a dream, a delirium caused by exhaustion or loud music. But it wasn't. Outside, a door opened. A neighbor in her bathrobe, her hair disheveled, brought her hands to her mouth when she saw the scene. A dog barked in the distance. A man ran into the middle of the street shouting for help. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Everything was suspended in that cruel moment where life and destiny crossed paths in a cruel way. Daniel didn't move. His body was lying there, his eyes half open, as if he were still trying to understand what had happened. His chest rose and fell weakly and irregularly, and a trickle of blood slowly ran down his front, mixing with the rainwater. The car was still stopped in the middle of the street, its headlights still on, cruelly illuminating the scene. The engine purred softly, as if it too were frightened by what had just happened inside it. Hector gripped the steering wheel tightly, his hands trembling, his eyes wide open. A woman in a shawl ran to the fence of the nearest house, her eyes wide open in horror. My God, someone call an ambulance. A younger man in a t-shirt and sandals rushed out, grabbing his cell phone with trembling hands. Sam, I'm going to call. Little by little, more people began to approach with hesitant steps, their eyes full of concern and fear. The heavy silence of Daniel's motionless body gave everyone who looked at him goosebumps. Hector felt a chill run down his spine. He had to get out of the car. He had to see what he had done. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Air entered his lungs irregularly, as if each breath were a struggle. With trembling hands, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the car door. Feeling the cold, damp air hit his face, his feet touched the puddle of water next to the vehicle, and he almost slipped. But it wasn't just the rain that made his legs buckle, it was fear. He took a few uncertain steps forward, feeling his heart beating painfully in his chest. His eyes couldn't look away from the man lying on the ground. The image was terrible. The destroyed cake next to him was a cruel reminder of what he had done. He turned toward him, his dark eyes shining with fury and despair. What did you do, you irresponsible man? Hector opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands opened and closed at his sides, as if searching for some way to alleviate the panic that was overwhelming him. The words got stuck before they could form. His gaze returned to Daniel. His chest rose and fell too quickly, and he felt like he was drowning. The woman in the shawl grabbed his hand. Her voice came out in a desperate whisper. "Stay with me, sir. Help is on the way, please." The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. Sirens began to sound in the distance, approaching quickly. Hector's legs felt weak, as if they were going to give way at any moment. He wanted to run away. He wanted to turn back time. He wanted to erase that moment from his life. But he couldn't. He knew that from that moment on, his life and that man's would be linked forever. The ambulance doors swung open, and the stretcher was hurriedly pushed inside. The wheels squeak-ached against the floor as the voices of doctors and nurses echoed through the corridors lit by a cold white light. Daniel's body was motionless, pale, his face covered with small cuts, and his chest rising and falling irregularly. "We have a 52-year-old man who was hit by a car, suffered a strong impact to the head, signs of trauma, unstable blood pressure. We need to act fast." The medical team moved quickly, making their way through the patients, waiting for attention in the crowded hallways. Some curious glances turned toward the scene as the sound of stretchers being adjusted and machines being turned on filled the air with suffocating tension. One of the doctors looked at the monitor recording Daniel's heartbeat and exchanged a worried glance with the nurse at his side. "He is very weak." In the corner of the hallway, a woman entered carrying a little girl in her arms. Her black hair was disheveled, her clothes wet from the rain, and her eyes red from crying, searching the room desperately. It was Rosa. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to stand because in her arms, pressed against her chest, was Camilla, who was clutching her mother's blouse tightly, not quite understanding what was happening. Rosa tried to approach, but a nurse put her hand on her shoulder, preventing her from moving forward. "You can't go in now. It's my husband, please." The nurse took a deep breath with a look full of compassion, but shook her head. "The doctors are doing everything they can. I promise we'll let you know as soon as we have any news." Rosa felt her legs give way, and if it weren't for the light weight of Karma in her arms, she might have fallen right there. Her eyes filled with tears, and her breathing became shakily as she lowered her head and kissed her daughter's hair. Camilla said nothing. She just hugged her mother tightly, her little eyes filled with fear. Time inside the hospital seemed to drag cruelly with each passing minute. Rosa stared at the doors of the emergency room, hoping that someone would approach her with good news, but no one came. Her heart was racing tight with fear of what might happen. Hours passed until finally a doctor came out of the room. Rosa jumped up, pressing Camilla against her chest. "Doctor, how is he?" The doctor sighed, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of his gown. His expression was tired, and Rosa knew before hearing the words that it would not be the answer she wanted. "We did everything we could. We managed to stabilize him, but the silence lasted too long, and Rosa felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. "But what, doctor? For God's sake, tell me now." The doctor looked at her sadly, still holding the clipboard, as if that could stop the weight of the words he had to say. "Your husband has fallen into a coma." The blow to his head was very strong now. Only time will tell if he will wake up. Rosa felt a wave of coldness wash over her body. Coma? That word felt like a punch in the stomach, something she couldn't accept. Daniel was fine. A few hours ago he was coming home with a cake for his daughter. How could he be there now between life and death? Trapped in a silence she couldn't reach. Camilla gently tugged at her mother's blouse, her little eyes wide with fear. "Mom, Dad's going to be okay, right?" Rosa hugged her daughter close to her chest, closing her eyes tightly, trying to hold back the tears. Her hands trembling as she stroked her hair, her breathing faltering. But even so, her voice came out firm, although barely a whisper. "Yes, my love. He promised he would come home." And at that moment, Rosa decided she would believe it, even if time tried to prove otherwise. The cold lights of the police station illuminated Hector's pale face as he sat in the hard chair, his hands still trembling on his knees. The smell of stale coffee mixed with wet paper filled the room, and the voices of the police officers who occupied the place seemed distant, almost unreal. He looked ahead but saw nothing. His mind was still trapped on the wet asphalt, on the motionless body on the ground, on the blood mixed with the rain. "Your father is on his way." The lawyer's voice sounded firm without any emotion. He was a man accustomed to solving problems like this, wearing an expensive suit with an indifferent look behind his thick-rimmed glasses. For him, this was not a disaster. It was not a tragedy. It was not the life of a man hanging by a thread. It was just another case that would be solved with money. Hector tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but couldn't. His chest felt heavy, as if someone had placed a block of concrete on top of it. The image of the destroyed cake remained etched in his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to push it away, but it was impossible. The door burst open and his father entered. A tall man with well-combed grey hair, wearing an impeccable suit. His eyes met his son's, and he took a deep breath before turning to the lawyer. "Take care of this." The lawyer had everything ready. Papers were signed, money was transferred, and in less than an hour, Hector was outside the police station. No, he wasn't in prison. There were no bars around him. But then, why did he feel like he was? He got into the black car, waiting on the sidewalk, and sank into the back seat without saying a word. His father got in next to him and slammed the door shut. The silence between the two was suffocating. The driver started the engine, and the car glided through the empty streets, leaving behind the police station, the hospital, the anguished faces, the life he had almost taken. "Let's talk about this once, and then never again." His father broke the silence in a voice that broke no argument. "The lawyer assured me that you won't go to prison. The man survived, but is in a coma. His family doesn't have the money to fight us, and that's enough." Hector turned toward the window, watching the city lights pass by quickly, like blurry spots. His chest tightened. Hearing those words, it was as if his father were talking about something small and insignificant, something that could be solved with a simple check. But it wasn't. And if he doesn't wake up, his father sighed, rubbing his temples as if the subject had already tired him. "Now he wants to be a martyr. If you want to punish yourself, do it. But not on the street, not in front of society. Life goes on. You have a future, Hector." He was just a shoemaker. That phrase broke something inside him, something deep, something he didn't even know he had. He felt like screaming, like saying that he wasn't just a shoemaker, that he was a man, a father, someone who came home with a cake for his daughter, someone who had a life, dreams, someone who was now lying in a hospital bed, not knowing if he would ever open his eyes again. But his mouth remained shut because he knew that nothing he said would make a difference. The car crossed the high gates of the mansion and stopped gently in front of the marble staircase. The house was huge, luxurious, full of shiny glass and golden details, a place where nothing was ever lacking except peace. Hector got out of the car without saying a word. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. He entered his room and closed the door behind him, leaning his back against it and letting his body slide down until he was sitting on the floor. The silence in the room was worse than the noise in the hospital. In there was only him and his guilt. He took out his cell phone and unlocked the screen. No new messages. No one knew what he had done. No friends asked about that night. To the world, nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. He ran his hands over his face, breathing deeply. His eyes were red and heavy. He could take a hot bath, lie down on his soft bed, and forget all this. But he knew that when he closed his eyes, he would see Daniel lying on the floor, the cake destroyed, the candles rolling in the rain. Life went on, as his dad said. But inside him, something had stopped. Something had broken, and he didn't know if he could ever fix it. The strong smell of disinfectant mixed with the cold hospital air, creating a feeling of cleanliness that was comforting to many. But for Isabella Ramos, it was just part of her day. Her light blue uniform was already a little wrinkled, and her sneakers, although well cared for, showed the wear and tear of someone who spends hours walking the halls. The cleaning cart squeaked softly as she pushed it, and the damp cloth slipped through her fingers as she wrung out the dirty water into a plastic bucket. The night shift was always quieter, but no less heavy. Isabella knew the routine well. She cleaned the hallways, the rooms, the bathrooms, changed the trash bags, organized anything that was out of place. People passed by her without noticing her presence. The doctors rushed by, the nurses whispered instructions to each other. The patients curled up in their beds, hoping to get better. And Isabella was invisible. No one stopped to ask her how she was. No one looked her in the eye. Deep down, she was used to it. Her grandmother always said, "Angels talk to those whom no one listens to." Isabella grew up hearing that. As a child, she didn't understand it well, but now working there, she saw that it made sense. How many times had she heard conversations that no one else heard? How many times had a patient muttered something to the ceiling and no one paid attention? How many times had someone cried alone in a corner of a room without anyone asking who? She stopped in front of one of the rooms and looked at the sign hanging on the door, Room 306. She took the key out of her pocket and pushed the door open carefully. The smell of the place was different, heavier, as if time passed more slowly there, slowly. The only sound was the soft beep of the machine monitoring the patient's heartbeat. He looked at the bed and felt a lump in her throat. The man lying there seemed too fragile, his skin pale, his eyes closed, his breathing so light that for a moment he had to hold his breath to make sure he was still there. The name on the chart said Daniel Walker. Isabella didn't know who he was, but something inside her told her that he wasn't just another patient. She pushed the cleaning cart into the room and began to mop the floor with slow, almost careful movements. She looked at him from time to time, trying to understand why this man made her feel so strange. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the fact that despite all the machines around him, he seemed to be alone. She stayed there for a few minutes, finishing her work, but something made her hesitate before leaving. She didn't know how to explain it, but she didn't want the silence to take over that room. "Hello." Her voice came out low, almost like a whisper. She felt silly talking to herself, but she continued, "My name is Isabella. I know you can't hear me. Or maybe you can. I don't know." She was silent for a few seconds, observing Daniel's serene face. "You seem like a good man, and someone must be waiting for you to wake up," she sighed, running her hands through her hair, which was gathered in a loose bun. "My grandfather was like this for a while. My grandmother talked to him every day. She said he could hear her. I don't know if it was true, but I think she never lost hope." She looked around, feeling a little ridiculous for being there talking to someone who wasn't responding. But there was something about talking that brought her some comfort. Her eyes fixed on the small photo stuck to the board next to the bed. It was a smiling girl with round cheeks and bright eyes holding a colorful balloon. "But your daughter needs you to come back." The room felt even quieter after that. Isabella felt a chill run through her body, as if she had just told a secret to someone who would never respond. But at the same time, she felt it was the right thing to say, even if it was just to fill that empty space, to give him a reason to fight. She lowered her gaze and squeezed the broom between her fingers, trying to ignore the strange feeling inside her. But before leaving, she took one last look at Daniel and whispered with a small, tired smile, "Well, I'll let you rest." She took the cart and left the room, closing the door carefully. But even as she continued her work around the hospital, the image of that man lying there, trapped in silence, would not leave her mind. The day dawned grey with a cold wind coming through the cracks in the hospital windows, bringing with it the smell of the rain that had fallen during the early morning. Isabella had already been there for several hours, finishing her tasks while observing the hurried movements of the doctors and nurses. Some families arrived to visit their relatives, bringing bags of clean clothes and fruit, trying to offer a little normality to those who were trapped within those white walls. But in room 306, nothing changed. Time seemed frozen around Daniel Walker. "Isabella," She pulled the cleaning cart down the hallway, dodging the employees who were rushing by until she stopped in front of the room's door. She took a deep breath before entering, feeling the same tightness in her chest as the day before. There was something there that she couldn't explain, but that made her want to turn back. She opened the door slowly and entered, closing it carefully behind her. The room was still the same, the air still heavy with that smell of disinfectant mixed with the cold coming from outside. Daniel remained motionless, breathing slowly, trapped in that silent world where no one could reach him. But Isabella smiled anyway. "Hello again, Mr. Walker," her voice breaking the silence of the room. She picked up the rag and began to clean the table next to the bed, moving the objects carefully, as if any sudden movement might interrupt his rest. "The hospital has gone crazy," she said as she wrung out the rag. "A man threw a tray of soup in the dining room. Food flew everywhere. I had to clean it all up by myself. It was a disaster," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "But you know what was worse? A nurse slipped right in front of me. It was like in the movies. Her feet left the ground and boom, she fell on her back. I didn't know whether to help her or pretend I didn't see anything." Her eyes were towards Daniel, waiting for a reaction, any movement. But he remained the same. Even so, she didn't feel silly for speaking. On the contrary, she felt something strange, as if it were the first time someone had really listened to her voice without interrupting her, without ignoring her. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms and observing Daniel's serene face. "I know it may seem silly, but I'm going to keep coming. It seems like you need someone to talk to," she sighed, looking at the small photo of Coma that was still attached to the board. "I promise I won't let this room remain silent." She looked at him once more, hoping that somehow those words would reach some corner of his mind. Then she gathered her things and left. The days passed slowly, and the hospital routine continued as usual. People came and went. Some were discharged, others arrived in serious condition, and the hallways remained filled with voices, hurried footsteps, and murmurs of concern. But inside room 306, time seemed to stand still. Rosa went to the hospital frequently. At first, she arrived early, sat next to the bed, and held his hand, speaking softly to him, telling him about her day, about Camilla, about how difficult everything was without him. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, something inside her began to change. The fear she felt at first gave way to deep exhaustion that came not only from her body, but also from her soul. The sad looks from the doctors, the lack of answers, the uncertainty, it all began to weigh on her. One day, sitting on the edge of the bed, she took Daniel's cold hand and squeezed it tightly, as if that simple gesture could wake him up. "You have to wake up," she said weakly, tiredly. "I don't know what to do anymore." She waited as she always waited, but as always there was no response. Her eyes filled with tears, and she forced herself to swallow her sobs. Camilla still needed her. Life went on, but how long could she continue to carry everything alone? The visits began to be less frequent. At first, she blamed herself for not being able to go every day. But then she began to wonder if it really made any difference. He never reacted, never moved his fingers, never gave a sign that he was still there, that he could still come back. Time took away the hope, and little by little, Rosa stopped going so often. Camilla, who at first asked about her dad every day, also stopped doing so. At first, she would look at Rosa with those big, bright eyes and say, "Daddy's coming back tomorrow, right?" And Rosa would force a smile, stroke her daughter's hair, and reply, "Yes, my love, he's coming back." Camilla began to accept it as children do when they realize that the world is not like in fairy tales. She still held her dad's photo before going to sleep, but she no longer talked about him with the same emotion. Time made her voice lower, and Daniel's name began to be spoken less and less in that house. In the hospital, a patient in a coma was just one of many difficult cases. Over time, his presence became part of the scenery, and he became just a name on a board, an occupied bed, a face that no one expected to see. Back in the room, Isabella noticed. She noticed how the flowers on the nightstand were already dry, How no one brought a new blanket, how the doctor's eyes no longer showed surprise at seeing him there. Day after day, she knew that in the hospital, no one had time to think too much about a patient who didn't respond. But for her, he was never just one more at the end of the shift. When everyone left, when the hospital grew quieter, when the visitors had already gone and the rooms were empty, she would enter that room, sit in the chair next to the bed, and talk. She would talk about what she saw during the day, about the funny things that happened, about her life, about how she felt. And even though there was no response, she kept coming back because deep down she believed that he was still there somewhere. The rest of the world might be forgetting Daniel Walker, but she wasn't, and for some reason she couldn't explain. That seemed to be enough to keep coming back. "Hello again, Mr. Walker," she murmured, closing the door behind her. She walked over to the chair next to the bed and sat down, looking at his serene face. The wires from the machines connected to his body, the way his chest rose and fell slowly. He seemed to be in a deep sleep, but Isabella liked to think that somehow he could hear everything she said. She took a book out of her bag. It was an old book, with worn pages that her mother used to read to her when she was a child. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling the texture worn by time, and smiled to herself before opening it. "Today, I brought a story. My mum used to read it to me before bed. I think I'm going to read it to you too." She slowly turned the pages until she found the story she wanted. She cleared her throat, straightened her posture, and began. Once upon a time, there was a king who had everything he could wish for: wealth, a large castle, and a golden throne. But what he wanted most was to find someone who could understand his heart. Her voice filled the empty room, and for a moment it didn't seem like she was talking to herself. She felt that those words, those stories, somehow reached him, even though no one else believed it. The king traveled to distant lands and searched every corner of the world, but he never found anyone who truly understood him. Isabella paused, looked up, and saw Daniel. "It sounds a little sad, right?" She waited for an answer. Although she knew it would not come, she sighed and returned to the book. But one day, when he least expected it, he found a simple peasant girl who offered him no gold, no jewels, no promises. She just listened to him, and for the first time, he felt truly seen. He closed the book, running his fingers over the cover again, and smiled. "I think we all just want to be heard, not silence," she replied. But for the first time, he didn't feel empty. There seemed to be something there, something he couldn't explain. He got up, put the book in his bag, and took Daniel's hand for a brief moment. "I'll be back tomorrow. I'll bring another story." And at that moment, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let that room fall into oblivion. She wouldn't let that man be just another invisible patient. The next day, the same routine. Isabella pulled a chair up to Daniel's bed and sat down, holding a book between her fingers. The same book of ancient tales. She opened it to a random page unhurriedly, letting the scent of the aged pages bring back memories of nights when her mother would hold her little hands and read until her eyes began to close on their own. "Today I will read another story for you, Mr. Walker," she murmured, resting her elbow on the arm of the chair. She turned a few pages and began. "Once upon a time, there was a young man who dreamed of crossing the ocean, but he was afraid of the deep waters. They said that on the other side there were lands full of colors and golden cities, but no one knew for sure. One day he met an old fisherman who told him, 'The biggest dreams are where fear tries to stop us from going.'" She paused, smiling to herself. "My mum loved this part. She said that sometimes you have to go even if you're afraid, because that's how in the most beautiful stories." She looked at Daniel, waiting as always for some sign that he was there. But the only sound in the room was the beeping of the machines and the soft breathing he still had. "I hope you're listening to me." She continued reading, letting those words bring a little life to that room, which would otherwise be just another forgotten corner of the hospital. She read for several minutes without worrying about the time, without expecting anything in return, just enjoying that silent company that somehow made sense. When she finished the story, she closed the book carefully, observing Daniel's peaceful face. Now I understand why my mother never stopped reading to my grandfather. She ran her hand over his face, feeling the weariness of the day weigh on her shoulders. But before she got up, she felt something, a movement, a strange sensation running through her arm, as if a slight squeeze had emerged at the tip of her fingers. She looked down and her heart raced. Daniel's hand remained motionless, his eyes wide open, not knowing if it had been real or just her imagination. "Mr. Walker, was it you?" She waited, her heart pounding, her whole body paralyzed by anticipation. But after a few seconds, he returned to the same state as before, no reaction, no other movement. But Isabella was sure of what she felt. The air remained trapped in her lungs, and her mind tried to find an explanation. The doctors always said that spasms were normal, that patients in comas sometimes had small involuntary reactions. But this didn't seem like that. It felt different. Her breathing was agitated and her hands were sweating when hesitantly she held his hand again. "If it was you, give me another sign." But the night remained silent. She got up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest, and ran into the hallway. She needed to tell someone, she needed confirmation. He found one of the nurses on duty, and with a trembling voice, she grabbed his arm. He moved his hand. The nurse blinked in surprise at the way Isabella spoke, as if she had just witnessed a miracle. "Mr. Walker." "Yes." He squeezed my hand. It was very slight, but I swear he really did it. The woman took a deep breath with a tired look and gestured for her to calm down. "Isabella Combs' patients sometimes have spasms. It's normal. The body reacts on its own without it meaning any improvement. It wasn't a spasm, it was different." The nurse gave her an understanding smile, but it was the same kind of smile they gave when they wanted someone to accept something difficult. "I'm going to notify the doctors so they can do new tests. But don't get your hopes up. This happens all the time." She patted Isabella on the shoulder and continued on her way. But Isabella stood there in the middle of the hallway, staring at the door of room 306. Hope. That was exactly what she had now. She returned to the room, closed the door slowly, and approached the bed. She looked at Daniel, analyzing every detail of his face, as if looking for any sign that he was trying to wake up. She sat down next to him, and without thinking, took his hand again, feeling the warm skin beneath her cold fingers. "If it was you, give me another sign, please." She waited a second, 2, 3, nothing. Her eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed her fingers around his hand, as if holding on to her last chance to be sure. "I know you're there, and I know you're trying to come back." She closed her eyes, swallowing her tears. "You have to come back." Her voice broke. She stood there with her head down, her hand still holding him, waiting for something to happen, waiting for that man trapped in silence would give another sign that he was still fighting. Even though the doctors said it was just a reflex, even though the nurses looked at her with pity, as if she were clinging to something impossible, Isabella never stopped believing. She sat by his side, held his hand whenever she could, and talked about him, about the patients she knew, about the little things that seemed silly but made her routine a little lighter. But above all, she talked about Camilla. "Your daughter must be even prettier in person." She stared at the photo stuck in the folder, the same photo that seemed to have been forgotten there for so long. "She has bright eyes, you know. You can tell she's a happy girl. I'm sure she misses you a lot." She paused, waiting as always for some action. "I wish I could tell her you'll be back soon." She took a deep breath, squeezing his hand gently. "But I think only you can do that." And then it happened. A tear, a small glisten, slowly slid down the corner of Daniel's face, tracing a silent path across his pale skin before disappearing into the pillow. Isabella opened her eyes in surprise, her heart beating fast in her chest. For a moment, she thought she was seeing things, that her mind was playing tricks on her because she wanted so badly for him to react. But no, the tear was there. It was real. She jumped up, not knowing what to do. She looked at him, waiting for him to open his eyes, to move his lips, to say something. "Mr. Walker." Her voice came out in a whisper full of emotion. He didn't move. He gave no further signs. But that tear made her hold his hand tighter, trying to control her breathing. "I heard you, right? You know Camilla is waiting for you." The silence in the room was the same as always. But for her now it was different because on the other side of that silence, Daniel was still there. He couldn't see any faces. He couldn't make out the hospital or the machines around him or the woman holding his hand with such hope, but he could hear. And that voice kept him there. It was like a thread holding him in the midst of endless darkness. He didn't know where he was or how much time had passed. He only knew that he wanted to keep hearing that voice, that presence that somehow brought warmth to a cold place. And in the back of his mind, where everything seemed distant and confusing, an image began to emerge. Camilla, his daughter's laughter, sounded like an echo coming from far away, like a memory trying to find him in the midst of that emptiness. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move, but he could feel. And if he could still feel, then he was still alive. He still had a chance to come back. The glass spun between Hector's fingers, the amber liquid moving slowly under the dim light of the bar. Music played softly in the background, mixed with the murmur of voices that mingled with laughter and empty conversations. But for him, nothing there felt real. No drink was strong enough to erase the only image that dominated his mind, the body on the floor, the cake in pieces. He raised the glass and drank it in one gulp, feeling the alcohol burn his throat, but not enough to numb the guilt that weighed on his chest. Since that night, months ago, he had tried to move on as his father wanted, as the lawyers assured him he could. There were no charges against him, no headlines about the accident. Everything was settled with money. But the problem was that his mind could not forget. He left the bar staggering, breathing heavily, his eyes burning with fatigue and alcohol. The cold, early morning wind hit his face, but even that did not make him feel more awake. He got into the car and sat there still, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, not daring to start the engine. He looked at himself in the rear-view mirror and almost didn't recognize his tired face, the deep circles under his eyes, the empty gaze. What did I do? The words came out in a whisper. He closed his eyes and the scene came back again like a sharp blow. The impact, the sharp sound of the crash, the bag flying through the air. He clenched his fists, feeling his chest ache. Why wouldn't it go away? Why couldn't he be like his father, like the lawyers, like everyone who said he should forget? He started the car and drove aimlessly, not even knowing where he was going. He just wanted to escape from himself, but all he managed to do was stop in front of his mother's house. He got out and knocked hard on the door. It was late, but he didn't care. After a few seconds, the light in the living room came on and the door opened. The woman stood firm, looking at him seriously, her arms crossed over her chest. "What time is it, Hector? Are you drunk again?" He entered without asking permission, running his hands over his face, trying to find the courage to say what he needed to say. "I can't forget." She closed the door inside, already knowing what he was talking about. "You need to sleep tomorrow. I heard a man, Mum. I almost killed him." She turned slowly, looking at him with a cold expression. "He survived. And you paid for what you did." "No, I didn't pay anything. I just threw money at the problem and pretended it didn't exist." His mother approached him, held his shoulders, and looked him firmly in the eyes. "Listen to me carefully, Hector. That's in the past. You have a future. You can't stay tormented by an accident. He has a daughter, Mom." Hector's cry echoed through the room, and for first time his voice broke. His mother slowly let go of his shoulders, crossed her arms and shook her head. Forget it. He was just a shoemaker. The silence that followed that sentence was worse than anything he had ever felt before. Hector felt his stomach churn as if he had been punched. He looked at his mother with a mixture of surprise and sadness. "Just a shoemaker," he laughed. But it was a bitter laugh without humor. That's how you see people, isn't it? As if some are worth more than others. She didn't answer, just looked at him, waiting for him to accept that truth as he always had. But this time, something inside him refused to accept it. Without saying another word, he turned and left, feeling that for the first time he had to face all this alone. The icy wind hit his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, spinning non-stop, filled with thoughts he had been trying to avoid for months. He walked aimlessly for a few minutes, his hands in his coat pockets, his steps heavy, as if each one carried the weight of the guilt that would not leave him alone. For the first time, he wondered what kind of man he was, what his life really meant. He had always had everything: cars, trips, parties, money. But now, when he looked at himself, he saw only emptiness. Nothing he possessed could change what he had done that rainy night. Daniel Walker was still in a coma. And while the world moved on, while his friends continued living as if nothing had happened, he felt trapped in that moment, at that crossroads, at that instant when his irresponsibility destroyed the life of a man who just wanted to go home with a cake for his daughter. He stopped walking, his eyes fixed on a tall building with illuminated windows silhouetted against the darkness of the early morning. The hospital. His heart beat with more force than ever before. He had never had the courage to go there. He had never seen the reality he had caused, but now he knew he couldn't keep running away. He took a deep breath, feeling his chest tighten. I have to do this. His steps were slow as he crossed the street and entered the main door of the hospital. The strong smell of alcohol and medicine invaded his senses, and the sound of machines and mixed voices created a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. His eyes scanned the lobby and hesitated for a moment, almost giving up. But then he saw a nurse behind the counter and approached her. I would like to know which room a patient is in. The woman looked up, waiting for him to continue. Hector took a deep breath before saying the name Daniel Walker. The nurse typed something into the computer, checked the screen, and pointed to one of the hallways. Room 306. His chest tightened even tighter. Now there was no turning back. He walked slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath his shoes, his heart racing. He passed other rooms, people carrying burdens he would never understand. And then he stopped in front of the door with the number 306. He stood there for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to find the courage. What would he say? What could he say to a man whose life had been destroyed by his irresponsibility? He closed his eyes and ran his face, trying to calm his thoughts. Then he opened the door. The room was simple with dim lighting, the smell of disinfectant, and the constant sound of monitors. And there, lying in bed, was Danielle. Hector held his breath. He looked so fragile, so different from how he had imagined him. His face pale, the wires of the machines attached to his skin, his chest rising and falling slowly. He was not a stranger. He was not just a name on a court file. He was a man, a father. He took a step inside, but stopped when he realized he was not alone. A young woman was sitting next to the bed, gently holding Daniel's hand, her eyes downcast, as if she were waiting for something. She did not look like a nurse. She slowly raised her face, and her eyes met his for an instant. No one said anything. Hector felt his breathing quicken, and the look he received was not one of curiosity or surprise. It was a look of anger, of shock, of something that seemed like a mixture of pain and disbelief. Her voice was low but charged with emotion. He realized at that moment that she knew who he was. And in that instant, he understood that asking for forgiveness would be much more difficult than he had imagined. Isabella stood up quickly, her fists clenched at her sides and her breath coming in gasps. Her chest rose and irregularly, and a wave of rage rose in her throat, as if she were swallowing fire. "Why are you here?" Her voice cut through the silence like a well-aimed blow. Hector opened his mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes were filled with something he knew well: pain, contempt, hatred. Her voice rose tremulously, as if she were holding back tears. "What do you want here?" Did you come to see up close what you did? Did you come to make sure he'll never wake up again? He felt the weight of those words like a punch in the stomach. No. The words got tangled up. He had never felt so small. Isabella took a step forward without taking her eyes off him, as if the mere fact of seeing him there was unbearable. It was you, wasn't it? It was you who left him in this bed. Hector swallowed, feeling the bitter taste of guilt again. It was an accident. Isabella's laugh was short, without a trace of humor. Accident? You ran over a man. You left him here, trapped between life and death. And now what? You come here for his forgiveness. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to breathe, searching inside himself for something to explain what he was feeling. But there was no explanation, only guilt, only a regret that burned every corner of his conscience. I didn't know what to do. So you went back to your luxurious home of luxuries and went on with your life while he stopped. Her voice failed her. Her gaze returned to Daniel. He was still there, his face pale, his breathing weak, his eyes closed as if he were still looking for the way back. Isabella's heart ached just looking at him. He was coming home. Her voice was now lower, broken. He was carrying a cake for his daughter. It was her birthday. Hector closed his eyes again, as if those words hurt more than the screams. Isabella ran her hands over her face, trying to contain her rage, trying to keep the tears from falling. You have no idea what you took away from him. The weight of those words fell on Hector as if an entire wall had come crashing down on him. He knew what he had taken away. He knew he could never give him back that time, that night. That cake that never reached the hands of a little girl waiting for her dad. But he needed be there, just me. Her voice came out weak and shaky. She needed to see him. Something inside Isabella broke when she heard him. The hatred still burned. But at the same time, something inside her told her that the man in front of her was not just a heartless murderer. He was a broken man, just like Daniel, just like her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm all the emotions that were fighting inside her. She looked at Hector one last time before whispering, "He's still here, and you too. Now tell me what you're going to do about it." He looked away, took a deep breath, and ran his hands over his face as if trying to shake off the weight of the conversation. His heart was beating fast, and for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid. Not of what might happen to him, not of the consequences that no longer existed, but of what that accident had turned him into. "I want to help," he said, his voice weaker than he wanted it to be. Isabella crossed her arms, her gaze hard to help. He nodded, not daring to look at her directly. "I want to pay for the treatment." She let out a dry, humorless laugh and shook her head. "Of course you do. After months, it's always the same. You don't destroy someone's life and then think you can fix it with money." Hector closed his eyes for a second, feeling his stomach churn. "I don't want to disappear after this. I need to do something. What you need is to understand that money doesn't buy everything." Hector looked up and met her gaze. "I know." The way she said it made something inside Isabella tremble. There was no arrogance, no superiority, only pain. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the emotions swirling inside her. "You can pay for the best doctors, cover all the expenses, but that won't give him back the time he lost." "I know, but I can't go back to the past." Isabella's eyes shone with something he couldn't decipher. "You can't. But you can decide what to do from now on." She knew she hated Hector. She knew she should see him only as the man who ruined Daniel's life, but at the same time, she was beginning to see beyond that. The Hector in front of her was not the same reckless young man who drove a fast car without caring who he ran over. He was broken, tormented, and that confused her, and she wanted to hate it. But something inside her was starting to tell her that maybe he was trying to be a better person, and forgiveness wasn't easy. The sun had barely risen when Isabella arrived at the hospital that morning. The sky was still half dark, with the first rays of light trying to break through the heavy clouds that promised rain. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked through the still empty hallways, where only a few nurses were changing shifts, and the strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of disinfectant. With each step she took toward room 306, she felt her heart beating faster. As she always did, she would stop by Daniel's bedside, take his hand, talk to him about his day, read him a story, or simply remain silent in the hope that he would feel that someone was still there. She pushed the door open carefully, letting the soft morning light illuminate the room. For a moment she thought everything was the same. The machines continued to make their rhythmic sounds. The IV still dripped slowly through the tube, and Daniel lay in the same position, as if trapped in a deep sleep. But then his eyes noticed something. He opened his eyes in surprise, took a step forward, and held his breath. His lips moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement. But there it was, Mr. Walker. His voice came out in a whisper, full of expectation and fear. She approached with her eyes fixed on his face, waiting, hoping it wasn't just his imagination. And then his lips moved again. Air escaped from his lungs, and he felt a lump form in his throat. My God, his heart was beating so fast. It felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. She leaned toward him, took his hand gently, and spoke softly, quietly, almost like a plea. "If you can hear me, try to speak." The silence in the room lasted for a few long, painful seconds, filled with uncertainty. But then, in a voice broken by time, the word came out like a sigh, like a fragile thread connecting him to life. Isabella brought her hands to her mouth, feeling tears fill her eyes. "My God," she exclaimed, jumping up, her heart racing, and ran to the door. "Someone help me," she said. "He's waking up." The hospital, which always seemed indifferent to that room, was awakened by her voice. The nurses looked at each other. Hurried footsteps echoed through the hallways, and in seconds doctors rushed into the room, approaching Daniel, checking the machines, touching his face, calling his name. "Daniel, can you hear my voice?" His eyes remained closed, his body too weak for any sudden movement. But his lips tried to move again, and a single tear rolled down his face. Isabella was crying. Hector appeared at the door, watching the scene, unable to move. The emotion on Isabella's face, the trembling of her hands, the sparkle in her eyes. He didn't know why, but seeing that made something inside him break. The man he thought would never come back was fighting. And there, at that moment, he realized that maybe there was still to be fixed. Isabella ran through the hospital corridors without looking back, her heart beating so hard that she could hear it in her ears. The doctors were still in the room examining Daniel, talking about the miracle they had just witnessed. But she knew she had to get out of there. She had to find Rosa. She had to find Camilla. She ran out the front door without even grabbing her coat. The cold morning air hitting her skin as she crossed the street. Each step felt like an impulse, a force greater than herself, as if her whole body knew she couldn't waste any more time. Rose's house wasn't far away. It was small with worn walls and an iron gate that creaked when it opened. It was a simple home, but it was all Daniel wanted to see again. When she reached the door, she paused for a second to catch her breath. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her hair over her face. Her hands trembled with emotion. She knocked on the wood hurriedly, knocking loudly. "Donna Rosa, it's me, Isabella. Open the door." A few seconds passed before she heard slow footsteps approaching. The lock turned and the door opened, revealing Rosa on the other side. Her eyes tired, her shoulders slumped under the weight of months without answers. "Isabella, what happened?" Isabella held her arms tightly, feeling tears burn in her eyes. He woke up. Time seemed to stand still. Rosa opened her eyes in surprise, her whole body frozen at those words. "What? What did you say?" Daniel moved his lips and spoke for a moment. Rosa didn't know how to react. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears, her mouth opened and closed without her being able to say anything. And then a sound came from inside the house. "Mummy, who's there?" Camilla, the little girl, appeared at the living room door, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled, hugging an old doll to her chest. Her innocent eyes searched for her mother's face before finding Isabella. "Is that the lady from the hospital?" Isabella felt her heart tighten as she looked at her. She was so small, so full of hope, still not quite understanding what was happening. She knelt down to be at her level and smiled with tears in her eyes. "Your daddy said your name." The doll fell from Camilla's hands, hitting the floor with a thud. The girl's mouth opened, and for a second it seemed as if she couldn't even breathe. Isabella nodded, taking the little girl's small hands in hers. "Yes, my love, your daddy is coming back." Camilla let out a sharp cry, a sound that mixed surprise, happiness, and something even she couldn't explain. She woke up, ran into the house, jumping for joy, shouting the same phrase over and over again, as if she needed to repeat it to believe it. Rosa brought a hand to her mouth, tears running down her face without her trying to stop them. "He's really coming back." Isabella held her hands and smiled. "He's trying, and now he needs you." Rosa closed her eyes and let out a cry of relief, of longing for a love that had never given up. That was the call of reason, and Daniel was finally responding. Daniel felt the weight of his own body as if he had been submerged in darkness for a long time, trying to find a way back. The feeling was strange, as if he were caught between a dream and reality, between a silent world and another full of voices that, although distant, were calling him. His chest rose and fell slowly, and for the first time in a long time, his fingers moved slightly on the sheet. His pale, tired face began to contract in an almost imperceptible effort, as if something inside him were slowly awakening. With a faint blink, his eyes opened. The brightness bothered him, and everything was blurry. The colors were mixed, the shape seemed without outline, and his heart beat a little harder as he tried to understand where he was. His breathing was irregular, and for a moment he felt afraid. But then a familiar voice, a voice that seemed to come from an old memory, filled the room. "Dad." The sound made something inside him tremble. His still weak eyes filled with tears without him realizing it. Camilla ran to the bed, her little feet hitting the floor hurriedly, her arms outstretched, her face lit up with such pure happiness that it seemed impossible to contain. "Dad." He blinked and his vision became clearer. It was her, the daughter he thought he would never see again. His lips tried to move, but his voice was still too weak. His breath caught when he felt Camilla's small hands holding his fingers, squeezing them tightly as if to make sure he was really there. "You came back. You came back for me." Daniel felt the tears sliding down his face, warm, laden with everything he couldn't say at that moment. Rosa was next to her daughter, holding back her tears, her hand trembling as she covered her mouth as if her heart was too tight to allow her to say a word. He tried to speak, but all he managed was an emotional sigh. Little Camilla climbed onto the bed, resting her head on his chest, holding his hand against her own face. "She knew you were coming back, Daddy." Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment he felt the warmth of his daughter's touch, hearing the sound of her voice, smelling her hair. He was back, but then his mind began to bring back memories. The noise of tires on wet asphalt, the light from the headlights illuminating his face, the deafening sound of the impact, the rain washing the asphalt. His chest rose and fell faster, and his eyes, previously filled only with emotion, turned toward the door. Hector was standing there in the same spot without moving, without saying anything. Silence spread through the room, heavy, laden with something no one could explain. Daniel's eyes, previously filled with tears of happiness, now carried something different. He remembered everything. The silence inside the room seemed heavier than the air itself. Camilla was still lying on Daniel's chest, her little fingers clutching his hand tightly, as if she feared he would disappear again. Rosa remained by his side, still unable to believe that this moment was real, her heart racing, tears slowly sliding down her face, but Daniel's eyes were fixed on the door. Hector remained standing there, unable to take a step forward or backward, his body rigid, as if any movement could worsen a situation that already seemed unbearable. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing was heavy, and his hands were cold and sweaty. He knew this moment would come. He always knew it would, but nothing could have prepared him for that look. Daniel's eyes were deep, filled with something Hector couldn't decipher. There was no surprise because Daniel already knew. He remembered everything. The car, the bright headlights, the pain, the cold rain mixed with blood. The weight of that memory squeezed Hector's chest, and he lowered his head. He was expecting the worst, expecting Daniel to scream, to say he hated him, to throw him out of there. But then his voice echoed in the room, weak but firm. "I know who you are." Hector felt a chill run through his body and closed his eyes, for a moment feeling the weight of guilt become even more suffocating. His desire was to disappear, to run away from there, as he did that night. But he couldn't. Not now. He waited for the rage, but it didn't come. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at his daughter before turning his gaze to Hector. What happened cannot be changed. Hector looked up, confused. He expected hatred. He expected to be thrown out of that place. But he didn't expect that. His voice failed him. He didn't know what to say. Daniel continued to watch him for a few seconds before doing something no one expected. He reached out his hand. Rosa opened her eyes in surprise. Isabella held her breath. Camilla, not fully understanding, just looked from one to the other, holding her father's sheet. Hector felt his heart stop for a moment. I don't deserve this." His voice broke with emotion. His chest seemed about to explode. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Daniel kept his hand outstretched. "Maybe not, but you need it." Hector felt his eyes burn. Everything inside him screamed that he should refuse, that he should punish himself for what he did, that he had no right to be forgiven. But that hand offered after all. A tear rolled down his face. Breathing heavily and his body trembling, he took a step forward and took Daniel's hand. At that moment, something inside him broke. The weight he had been carrying for months. The guilt that devoured him, the darkness that made him feel lost, everything became lighter. And for the first time in so long, he was able to breathe properly. The hospital was quieter that night. The hallways, once crowded with people, now seemed empty, and the fast-paced routine of the day had slowed to a calmer rhythm. Isabella walked slowly, feeling the weight of recent events on her shoulders. Daniel was awake. Camilla could finally look into her father's eyes again. Rosa held her hand every day, as if she were afraid she would disappear again. Hector stopped near the hallway window and looked out below. The city continued at its own pace, full of flashing lights and cars traveling through the streets. But inside her, everything was still. For so long, her life had revolved around that room. That voice she was trying to reach. That hope that no one else had now. Daniel was coming back, and for the first time, she wondered where she belonged. She sighed, crossing her arms and feeling the cold wind hitting his face. He didn't want to admit it. But he felt lost. "You feel that too?" The voice came softly from behind her. She turned and found Hector standing there with his hands in his pockets and a tired look on his face, as if he too were fighting something inside himself. He let out a short, joyless laugh now that everything is fine. "We don't know where to go." Isabella didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, and she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Hector was no longer the same man who had entered that hospital weeks ago. He was no longer the young man who used money to fix his mistakes and ran away from the consequences. He was there beside her, carrying the weight of everything he had done, trying to find a way to move forward. "I don't know what to do now." She looked away toward the window. "For so long, I thought that asking for forgiveness was enough. But I realized that there are things that can't be fixed with words alone." She observed the way he spoke, the guilt still present in his voice, but now mixed with something different. A genuine desire to be a better person. "Have you decided to do something good with this?" "I tried, but I still feel alone." The confession took Isabella by surprise. She looked at him, and for the first time she felt her heart react in a way she didn't expect. Something inside her said she should hate him forever, that she could never forget what he did. But another part, a part she didn't want to admit, told her that maybe he was as lost as she was, and that scared her. Because if acknowledging his pain made her feel something different, then maybe she was changing too. The silence between them lingered, heavy, laden with something neither of them could explain. The city sparkled outside, but there in that hallway the world felt small, as if only the two of them existed, along with all the unanswered questions. Hector looked at Isabella as if he were gathering the courage to say something he had been holding inside for a long time. His fingers had been clenched inside his coat pockets, and his chest rose and fell slowly, trying to hide the anxiety that grew with every second. "I know I can never change what I did." Isabella looked down at the floor, feeling a knot in her chest. "I know." Hector took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair, confused, unsure, trying to find the right words. "But what if? What if I could be a better person from now on?" She slowly looked up, fixing her eyes on him. "I know what you mean." He hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine, but he knew he couldn't keep running away. "I mean, I want to try. I want to learn to be a man who does the right thing. I want to build something that really helps people. I want to use what I have to change lives, and I want to do it by your side." Those words hit her hard. Isabella felt her heart race, her hands grow cold, and for a moment she didn't know how to react. He was asking her for a chance, not just to start over, but to be with her. She felt her eyes burn because part of her wanted to believe. She wanted to believe that people could change, that he was no longer the same irresponsible man who destroyed Daniel's life that night. But the other part, the part that remembered every tear, every pain, every injustice, still carried the weight of the past. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to understand what she was feeling. "I don't know, Hector." Her voice was low and uncertain. He took a step forward without touching her, without forcing anything, just waiting, just giving her the choice she never had. "I can wait." Isabella's chest rose and fell slowly, and she felt the struggle within her because forgiveness was difficult. But sometimes giving your heart a chance was even more so. Time passed slowly, as if the world were trying to adjust after everything that had happened. The seasons changed. Life went on, but inside Isabella the doubt still existed. Some of it was because she was afraid of what might happen if she gave in to her feelings. Heart was even harder. Time passed slowly, as if the world was trying to adjust after everything that had happened. The seasons changed, life went on, but inside Isabella the doubt still existed. Some wounds take longer to heal. Some pains don't go away so easily. She continued with her routine at the hospital, working night after night, seeing faces come and go, lives lost and saved. But even though she was busy, even though she tried to keep her mind away from the past, something inside her always made her think of him, of Hector. She didn't see him for a while after that conversation in the hallway, after that request for a chance that she didn't know how to respond to. He disappeared. Part of her believed that he had given up, that he had returned to his old life, that it had all been just an impulse from someone who wanted to feel better about himself. But deep down, there was another part. A small voice inside her that said that maybe he was really trying. Only months later did she discover the answer. That morning she was passing by the community hospital in the poorest neighborhood of the city, the same hospital where Hector had stopped that night when he made his decision. She didn't expect to see him there, but there he was. He was wearing a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his hair tousled by the wind, his hands dirty with paint as he held a board and talked to a group of doctors and engineers. Isabella stopped on the sidewalk and watched him. He was different. He was no longer the arrogant young man who believed that money solved everything. He was no longer the lost boy who tried to drown himself in his own guilt. Hector was building something, She saw him walking around the site, pointing out details in the structure of the building, listening to the workers' suggestions, greeting some children who were passing by, and even carrying one of them when he fell while playing. The change in him was real, and for the first time, Isabella realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to give him that chance. She didn't seek him out after that day. She still wasn't sure how she felt, if she was ready to leave the past behind, if she could make room for something new. But deep down, she knew she was waiting for him. And he came. When she looked up, there was Hector standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on her as if no one else existed at that moment. He didn't say anything. He just watched as if looking for an answer. Before she even asked the question, the wind blew harder. And then the first small cold drops began to fall, splashing the ground and forming dark spots on the asphalt. Isabella felt her heart race, but she didn't look away. Not this time. Hector took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough for her to feel his breath. His chest rose and fell slowly, and there was something in his gaze that made Isabella forget the rain, the fatigue, the world around her. He raised his hand carefully, his cold fingers touching her face so delicately that she closed her eyes for a second. There was no rush, no doubts. It was as if that moment had already been written, as if they both knew that sooner or later this would happen. She opened her eyes and found his so close, so full of something that needed no words. And then he kissed her. It was a soft kiss at first, as if they were both still afraid of breaking something too precious. But as the rain increased, as the drops slid down Isabella's hair and down Hector's face, the kiss became more intense, more real, as if all doubts and fears had been washed away by the cold water falling on them. Hector held her face more firmly, as if he wanted to engrave that moment forever, and Isabella allowed herself to feel without fear for the first time. The rain continued to fall, cars passed in the distance, lights began to come on in the city, but none of that mattered because at that moment nothing was more real than the two of them. It was a beautiful day with the sun shining the cobblestone streets and a light breeze blowing through the trees. It was one of those days that seemed ordinary to anyone else. But for Daniel, it meant something much bigger. He was finally coming home. The car drove slowly through the neighborhood where he had lived all his life. The simple houses, the modest shops, the people sitting on the sidewalks chatting. Everything seemed the same, but he knew it wasn't because he wasn't the same man who had left there either. That rainy night, Rosa held his hand as she looked at him with an emotional smile. Camilla, sitting in the back seat, kept moving her little legs anxiously. "Is it much further, Mum?" Rosa laughed softly and looked at her husband. "What do you think, Daniel? Are you ready?" He took a deep breath, smelling the scent of the wind and feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. Yes. The car stopped in front of the small shoe store. The sign, already slightly worn by time, was still there. The shop windows that once displayed the shoes made by his hands were now empty, covered by a thin layer of dust. Daniel stood there looking for a few seconds, as if he were absorbing everything. Camilla was the first to get out. She ran to the door and tried to turn it. "The horseshoe." "Daddy, open it. I want to see everything." Rosa helped Daniel out of the car calmly. He was still weak. His movements were slower, but there was a new strength within him. With a deep sigh, he took the key out of his pocket and opened the door. The smell of wood and leather filled the air as soon as they entered. The shop was small, but held years of dedication. The empty shelves seemed to be waiting to be filled again. Camilla ran to the counter and ran her little fingers over the table where her dad always worked. "Are you going to fix shoes again, Daddy?" Daniel smiled and stroked his daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, but first I have to put everything in its place." Rosa looked around excitedly. "This place was always your dream, Daniel." He took a deep breath, running his hand over the workbench, remembering the nights he stayed there late to ensure his family's livelihood. And now it would be again. Before they could continue, the door creaked and someone entered. Daniel, He turned slowly and saw Hector standing there. The silence lasted a few seconds. Camilla took her father's hand and looked at the visitor, not knowing what to say. Hector looked different. He was no longer wearing expensive clothes, nor did he have the lost look he had before. He was carrying a bag in his hands, and his face showed a mixture of doubt and respect. "I brought you something." Daniel frowned and watched as Hector took a pair of old shoes, worn out by time. "They belonged to my grandfather. He always said that a good shoemaker not only repairs shoes, but also stories." Daniel took the shoes carefully, feeling the weight of those words. "Why do you want to repair them?" Hector took a deep breath before answering. "Because I want to start off on the right foot." Daniel looked at him for a few more seconds and then smiled slightly. "Then I think I can help you." Hector nodded, and at that moment they knew that somehow this wasn't just the repair of a pair of shoes. It was the repair of something much bigger. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of the small shop, illuminating the antique furniture and tools that Daniel was rearranging on the workbench. The smell of leather and wood filled the air, bringing back memories of a time that seemed so distant, but was now there again, within reach. Camilla played on the floor, drawing on a piece of paper while humming softly. On the other side of the counter, Daniel and Hector sat talking. Rosa watched them without saying anything, leaning against the door with her arms crossed and her eyes attentive to every detail. It still seemed incredible to her to see Hector there, talking to the man whose life he had almost destroyed. But what surprised her most was not the fact that he was there, but that Daniel was willing to welcome him. "That hospital you're building," said Daniel, holding a piece of leather between his fingers. "Looks like a good project." Hector ran his hand through his hair, a little uncomfortable. "I'm just trying to do something useful." Daniel looked up at him. "And you're succeeding." Hector was silent for a moment before responding. "I don't know, but I think so." Daniel smiled slightly and refocused on the material on the table. "Then keep trying." Rosa felt a tightness in her chest. It was strange, but at the same time it felt so right. The man who had once been just an irresponsible boy now seemed like someone completely different. Hector's eyes no longer had that lost look. There was no more arrogance, no more weight of someone trying to run away from himself. He was there, facing the consequences of his mistakes. And Daniel, who had every reason to hate him, chose to offer words of help instead of hurting. Rosa sighed and looked at her daughter, who was still distracted by her drawings. "Camilla, what are you drawing?" The girl lifted the paper and showed it with a smile. "A new house, just like the hospital that Uncle Hector is going to build." Hector opened his eyes in surprise. "I'm an uncle now." Camilla laughed and shrugged. "If you're cool." Daniel let out a low laugh, and Rosa shook her head, a silent tear running down her face. Fate was strange. It put people in each other's paths in unexpected ways. Sometimes to cause pain, sometimes to teach something, but occasionally it gave a second chance. And when that happened, all that was left was to decide what to do with it. The routine at the hospital was the same. The hallways were still crowded, the voices of the doctors mingling with the murmurs of worried families. The smell of medicine and disinfectant still filled the air, but for Isabella, everything felt different now. She pushed the cleaning cart down the hallway, but she no longer felt invisible. The same walls that had once seemed cold now felt welcoming, and the faces that had once passed by without noticing her presence now recognized her. Hector walked beside her, holding a folder with notes about the community hospital he was building. He talked about the details of the construction, the equipment they still needed to buy, and the doctors who were volunteering to provide free care. But deep down he was talking about something much bigger. "I want this place to be different. I want it to be a hospital where no one is treated like a mere number." Isabella looked at him and smiled. "You're not the same anymore, you know." Hector shrugged and smiled wryly. "Maybe I was never who I was supposed to be." They stopped in front of one of the rooms, and Isabella looked inside. An elderly woman was lying there staring at the ceiling with a tired expression. No one was there with her. There were no visitors or family members holding her hand. Isabella sighed and took a chair. "I'll stay with her for a while." Hector watched as she sat down next to the woman and gently took her hand. "Hello, Donna Estela. How are you feeling today?" The woman slowly turned her face and blinked, surprised to have company. "I'm here." Isabella smiled and squeezed her hand affectionately. "Yes, and so am I." Hector stood there for a moment. Obando saw the way Isabella spoke, how she gave her attention, how she made that woman feel less alone. And then he knew Isabella had found her place. It wasn't just in the hospital. It wasn't just next to the patients that no one noticed. It was next to those who needed someone who could see beyond. And somehow he knew that his place was beside her if she would let him. The sweet aroma of vanilla and chocolate, the little house, the kitchen lit by a warm light, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air with a joy that was difficult to describe. Camilla ran back and forth with her hair tied back in 2 braids and her eyes shining with excitement as she looked at the table where a large, beautiful cake awaited the right moment. Daniel sat in the wooden chair near the window, watching everything with a gentle smile on his lips. He was still recovering. His body no longer had the same strength as before. His steps were slower, and sometimes he needed to stop to take a deep breath. But none of that mattered because he was there. He was alive. Rosa arranged the candles on the cake, adjusted her daughter's dress, and crouched down next to her, ready to make a wish. Camilla looked at her dad and then at Hector, who was standing discreetly but noticeably in the corner. She smiled and crossed her fingers. "I think so." The children began to sing lasanas, and applause filled the small room with such beautiful energy that it was impossible not to get emotional. Isabella looked at Hector and saw that he was smiling too. But there was something else in his gaze, something deep. When the song ended, everyone turned to look at Camilla. She closed her eyes tightly, clasped her little hands in front of her chest, and remained silent for a few seconds before blowing out the candles. The moment was brief, but it seemed eternal. Daniel felt his eyes burn, and for an instant all the memories came flooding back to him. The rainy night, the bag with the cake, the wet asphalt, the silence that followed. But now there in front of him was proof that life had given him a second chance. He took Rose's hand, squeezed it affectionately, and looked at Hector, who looked away, a little uncomfortable, but with a sincere smile on his lips. The past could not be changed, but the future could be built. Camilla opened her eyes, looked at her dad, and jumped into his arms, hugging him tightly. "What did you wish for, my love?" he asked, kissing her hair. The girl smiled, looking at everyone around the table, and replied in a low voice, as if it were a secret, "That we always be together." Daniel closed his eyes for a second, holding his daughter tightly against his chest, and knew in that moment that this was the best gift he could receive. The cake was already almost covered in crumbs on the tablecloth, and the children were running around the house laughing loudly, their faces covered in frosting. Rosa was clearing some plates while Daniel watched everything in silence, his heart full of gratitude for being there, for seeing his daughter smile, for feeling life beating around him. Hector and Isabella were standing next to the table, discreet but present. He was holding a glass in his hands, turning it slowly as if trying to find the courage to say something he still didn't know how to put into words. She, on the other hand, was just watching. Ever since Hector reappeared in her life, ever since he showed that he was trying to be a different man, something inside her began to change. Camilla, sitting in the chair next to her dad, still held the last slice of cake, but her attention was elsewhere. Her curious eyes rested on Isabella and Hector as if she were thinking about something much bigger than her age allowed her to understand. Then she smiled. She knew. Isabella frowned in confusion. "Did you know, little one?" Camilla looked at Daniel for a moment, then at her mom, and then looked back at the two of them. Angels speak to those who listen. Silence filled the room. Daniel blinked several times, feeling a lump in his throat. Rosa paused and brought a hand to her face. Isabella felt her heart stop. For a second, Hector looked away, trying to contain his emotion. Camilla didn't know everything that had happened. She didn't understand the weight those words carried. But somehow she understood what no one had explained to her. Angels did not have wings. They had hands that held those who were lost. They had voices that filled the deepest silences. They had hearts that, despite the pain, still chose to believe. Hector looked at Isabella and found her eyes shining with emotion. It was not just a child's phrase. It was the most beautiful truth he had ever heard. And there, in that moment, everyone knew that destiny, however hard it might be, had done exactly what it had to do. Because in the end, love always finds a way. If you were in their shoes, would you forgive them? Share your thoughts in the comments and watch the videos on the screen. I'm sure you'll think very differently after watching their stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss these miraculous stories.